Today we got a Game Master Tips video for running the dice in Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars RPG. So this kind of assumes you already know how to roll the dice as a player. Watch that video if you haven't or learn it somewhere else. Anyway, tips for running the dice for your Game Masters. First off, we're going to start with house rule of sorts, or something I stole from Genesis. Limit the characteristics of your players. Or, to put it another way, respect the D6s, because this game, one of the big flaws that Genesis kind of fixes is that it doesn't really respect the D6s. Your black setback die, your boost die, providing penalties and bonuses to outside circumstances, little decisions your players might make, or early talents they have, or circumstances of the location, whatever. They help modify the dice pools. The big issue, though, is that they don't really have big enough of an impact on a regular basis to where they matter at all. They just don't, they feel useless all the time. Early on, they kind of matter a little bit, but that goes away. The dice pools are just too high. They need to be reined in. So I say max at 5, like Genesis, just like Genesis, kind of like Genesis. Except I also like the caveat that temporary buffs can raise from 5 to 6, but it has to be temporary. Base characteristics at 5 or something similar. Rein the main dice pools in so that the value of these, and therefore the value of your players' actions and early talents, that it exists. Why even bother getting a talent to remove setback die? They hardly do anything at all, it seems. I mean, you could always add in more, but do we really need to just print more money? What will matter are those early talents your players buy in order to separate themselves from the rest of the pack. Because the way this game works, you want to put all of your points into your characteristics at the very start, and so there's not a lot of going into talents or even skill ranks. So what separates one intellect-focused person from another intellect-focused person is not that big. Usually like starting equipment, right? And then maybe a talent they get, maybe a free rank or two. Like, you kind of want the line to be bigger, unless you're starting with points after creation, which you probably should. Most characters aren't going to have a lot to work with to make their character really stand out in any kind of way right out of the gate, which I would want to have, but the talents they buy will matter more, and also the decisions they make will matter more. They do a knowledge check to find research information, and that can add boost die onto someone else's check later on because of that knowledge. Oh, you found out he actually has a clinical phobia or whatever of heights or something, and that helped with the talking check. You did the research, you found some sort of weakness in someone, and that helped the talker with the talking check 2 sessions later, and the boost die actually matters, instead of just pumping in more D6s or resorting to upgrades to reds or yellows just to feel something. Tip number 2. Not every mechanical thing needs a story reason for why it happens. Because you've seen and heard the examples, and I've said plenty myself, where you hit the Wookiee with the vibroblade and you got successes but also threats, and okay, so you hit them, but they scream in your face, right? This like determined scream, and they don't even seem like they're in pain so much as it's anger, and so it's putting this stress on you, and you take some strain, or you take a dice penalty on your next check because you're shaken up by the thing, or they block your last blow, and the jarring sensation of you hitting their weapon, and blah 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 blah. Narrative thing to explain, which is just basically the normal ebb and flow of battle. You don't need to spend your time every time coming up with narrative fluff for why you have penalties or why you're stressed out. Fighting is stressful. You could succeed and be tired by the effort, or you could fail and be tired by the effort, or you could succeed and be galvanized by your success and get a little boost, a little peppiness, or you could fail and be galvanized by your failure. You missed and you're determined, you dig down deep, and so you're going to get a little help on your next turn. Like, this is just general flow of battle, just sort of basic psychology, or as much as you would need in an action-adventure RPG. You and the players can all just assume that this stuff is happening, and every once in a while, when it feels natural and flows naturally, you can come up with a more specific reason why strain is happening, or why the player is going to be inaccurate, or why the stormtrooper is now lower defense. You shot at the stormtrooper and you got no successes, but you got a bunch of advantages. Okay, so you fire your blaster and the stormtrooper dodges, but they stumble out of their cover, and, you know, then the mechanical stuff. But only if it flows naturally, so you can keep the game going. You are by no means obligated to come up with some cinematic, flowery language for why this stuff happens. It doesn't need an explanation. Battle is tiring, and adrenaline can do crazy things, and you can get second wins and get tired out, and you're overthinking it. It's really not that big of an issue. Everyone seems to have an issue with the dice, and it always seems to be revolving around that. Not really an issue at all. You're overthinking it. And this kind of brings me to my next tip, a nice, very short one. Tip number 3. Don't let your players come up with explanations all the time. Don't make that the normal thing. I know in the advertisements they talked about, like, oh, it's a collaborative narrative between you and the players, and, like, don't let the players try and narrate every little thing, because then you have, like, 5 people struggling to come up with some I can't even say the word, flowery description, purple prose for what is going on and what they're doing specifically. Not every attack needs a big description thing, and don't create a scenario to which all the players are going to feel like they can and also should have to come up with all this description crap. I guess this goes for any RPG, but it feels like it's calling for it more than any other because of the narrative dice and these special results and all that other crap. Just never set that example. Or alternatively, only make triumphs and despairs something that you have this extra descriptive prose. Like, what's the point of going out of your way to be colorful with it unless it's something really awesome? So yeah, if triumphs are involved on an attack check, and that attack check results in the killing of an enemy, regardless of how the triumph is spent, I don't even care. Just then take it as an opportunity. Okay, how do you do it, or whatever. Keep the game moving, keep the thing moving, keep the video moving, Steve. Okay, so tip number, whatever this is next. Make the location just as important as the enemies, and yeah, I guess we could say this with any RPG, but we have a built-in fuel source for the scene doing stuff. It's like the Sentinels card game. You have the environment deck. Try to have that with every encounter. You have the villain deck, you have the hero decks, you have the environment deck, which is sort of neutral, I guess, in this case. Now, example I really like on how to do this, and one I use every so often, in the Lords of Nalhada's sourcebook, there is just one encounter where it's like a shootout in a outdoor market bazaar kind of a thing, and there is a chart of how to spend advantages and threats that are specific to that type of location. And, you know, really any source book, or most source books, have charts like that. Sometimes they're about spending results in locations, sometimes they're with certain types of checks, spending them in investigations, for example. Other times, you know, like in the Aces source book, spending these in an asteroid field. I want you to make a chart, maybe less extensive if you want, before a specific location. The more specific, the better. Make that place feel real, like it's a living world, and you guys are just sort of playing in it. In fact, in one of my Hired Gun videos, the Hired Gun book review, which might not even be out yet, we talk about, there's like an example encounter where you fight a Wookiee, and then at one point the floor could break, and then the food processor like just starts squirting everywhere. So you're on a different level now, and also there's food gunk like spilling out like a waterfall of food gunk, and it's none of that is statted, unfortunately, but that's a good idea. What you could do is, okay, there's gonna be a fight in the cantina somehow, or there probably could be, maybe. You decide the floor is rickety. It's especially rickety, maybe it's an older place, or maybe there's been fights before, a recent fight that's related to your story, or whatever. For whatever reason, the structure of the floor isn't so good, and I guess there's also a food processor. So those two things alone can give us certain ways of spending these symbols in a scaling kind of way. Okay, so the floor is unstable. So maybe threats could be spent on an attack check to have their foot kind of like break through, and that causes them to stumble, and maybe, actually, more specifically, instead of just an explanation for why you have your sort of bread and butter strain and dice pool manipulations added on, the general ebb and flow of battle, but this time with a little more flavor. Instead of that, we can specifically add the immobilize condition onto someone if they roll 2 threats on an attack check. So they attack, but their foot breaks through the floor, and now they are immobilized and have to deal with that. And we can have the scale upward. 3 threats and a despair will cause the floor to collapse in the localized area right below them, and maybe if they're fighting someone, they both fall, but the person they're fighting kind of like falls on top of them, so they get extra damage, or there's penalties. So sure, maybe they hit and damage their enemy, but also they have to take enemies' brawn plus bonus successes on their own attack, because the enemy's like falling on top of them. Also, the reason you're using your own successes to help scale with the damage is that it just keeps things flowing. I love that. I love turning things back onto players and using their own bonus success plus some other relevant stat. That's always been a favorite thing I have in my back pocket. And then maybe double despairs could be the entire floor collapses, or a big chunk of the floor, but it's mostly just affecting your party. I mean, they're despairs. They're supposed to affect the rolling person negatively and not just everyone evenly, depending on where they are in the scenery, in the location. So maybe the rolling player and then the 1 or 2 players closest to them collapse to the ground below. Because they might be scattered, it wouldn't make sense if only the party members fell. That's weird. And that brings me to my next point. How these symbols could be spent could be dependent on player or enemy location. You know, there's a food processor on the far wall, so maybe if someone does a successful hit while they're near the food processor, maybe it's weaponized, right? So they can spend advantages to add, let's see, a disorient quality, because you grab your opponent, slam them in the food processor, food processing gunk or whatever gets onto their face, and so now they're disoriented. And this could scale up positively or negatively to where you slam someone into the food processor and it breaks, but they kind of move out of the way and the food squirts you in the face and or an ally in the face, or it goes onto the floor and then the puddle makes its way to an ally as just all this processed food gunk is squirting everywhere and your ally slips and falls in it, that sort of thing. I guess once that happens, the cat's kind of out of the bag and you don't really need to make the food processor stuff location based because it's everywhere. But think about your location, and especially if you have a map, you can just point at stuff. Okay, what is that? How could that go wrong? How could that be used as an improvised weapon? We're doing a battle in a hangar. Okay, is it possible that a technician might be at a terminal working on something? There's exposed wiring and electrical stuff. Is there a rusty balcony on an elevated platform? Elevation, that's another big thing. You should have automatic bonuses and penalties to elevation. Anyway, point is, think about your location as much as you do the enemies. Make that sort of a neutral, semi-neutral, maybe mostly hostile, maybe only partially hostile force. Actually change that up, come to think of it, depending on the situation. It's just a whole new layer to make battle more interesting, and also it's just, if you make a chart out of it, you have an easier time coming up with explanations for why the dice do different things, and you have specific examples written out. Look through the weapon qualities. Is there one that could represent something in the real world? Okay, apply that to a location and come up with a way in which it could inflict that onto whoever happens to pass by. And then, what would the natives say about this type of battle? Is there wildlife? Would the wildlife be attracted by the bright sounds and the colors? Would they be scared away? Would there be a stampede? Build your locations for more memorable encounters, especially when it comes to combat, and also you'll just have an easier time dealing with this mess. And let's wrap things up with a final tip that's nice and quick and easy and simple: how to deal with the triumphs and despairs, because these things are really big, and if you don't plan for them and are still stumped, just the easiest way to deal with them: bank them. Bank triumphs and despairs. Not everything you purchase with these symbols in general need to happen directly from the check being done. It kind of helps if you shoot a guy and then they drop their weapon because you shot out of their hand, but it doesn't have to be the case. It could just be some other bad thing simultaneously happening. I guess it's a tip unto itself, isn't it? Also, this bad side effect or good side effect, despair, triumph, whatever, it could happen later on. Or it could be happening behind the scenes, gears are already in motion, but the players don't know. And that is the best thing to do with despairs especially, is when they roll, and they're like, oh no, and then, they succeed at the thing, and this happens, they resolve everything, and then they just sit there and they wait for you to tell them what to do with their double despair. You look at them, and you look at the dice, and you look at them, maintaining eye contact, and you grab the despairs, shuffle them behind your GM screen, and you say, your turn. That is the best thing to do in this game, because they know something's coming. They have no idea what it is. And odds are, you don't either, but you don't need to. These are in your back pocket to inflict onto them in whatever way you want. And it could be just something as simple as, okay, someone remembers what you did here. There's a fight happening. Okay, they blame you. I don't know, maybe you accidentally stepped on their cat in the middle of a firefight, you didn't realize it, or whatever, or you shot a thing and their grandma died. You had no idea that you were part of some supervillain origin story. You had no idea. Then they show up later when you're running from the Empire out of nowhere. They've been tracking you, or so, I don't know. Or it could just be the Empire has decided to dispatch some bounty hunter or some inquisitor or powerful agent. Or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Even in its most simple, non-narrative attached form, just think of it as like a really awesome evil currency you can spend. I'm going to spend despairs just to throw in another copy of this enemy you hate. They're just going to come up from behind the bushes because of that despair from before, because why not? I'm GM, I can do what I want. Though obviously the narrative-tied stuff is probably more fun and interesting, but still, bank your despairs, bank your triumphs, which actually a little different with triumphs because it's technically like up to the players, and so if they run out of ideas, they don't know what to do with their triumph, sometimes I'll just ask, okay, do you want me to bank it for you? And I'll just write it down, maybe the circumstances under which they got the triumph, so if I can relate it narratively some way, tie it to where it kind of makes some sort of story sense. It doesn't have to, but I do it anyway, and then at some point, I don't know, the cavalry swoops in, and I have so many dice, I like having them set to those symbols behind the screen so I can just play them as I'm describing it, and then they can make the connection. Oh, because of the triumph earlier, then, oh, okay, I see, and you don't have to waste time explaining it, right? Oh, and that actually reminds me of final tip, which this is a really minor thing. I like to do it sometimes, I don't do it nearly as enough as I should, but when it comes to narrating what's happening and what's going on, if you do take the time to do it step by step, there is something just kind of satisfying as a player and as a GM where as you're explaining it, you are removing dice from the play area that are relevant to it. And I mainly do this if there's like a despair or a lot of threats or both, and I'm going to be spending those threats on multiple different things or just one big horrendous thing, because then we can get sort of a countdown. Okay, so you succeeded at your check, and here's some description, blah, blah, blah. You do some damage, and oh, the enemy goes flying, blah, blah, blah. Oh, advantages, and okay, you did the thing. You spend them how you want to. More description, blah, blah, blah. I'm slowly pulling away dice as we get to, and then, there's threats instead, and okay, these two threats are spent here, and slowly making our way towards the bigger cluster of threats, or despair, or something. I don't do it all the time, but it's fun, just adds a bit more flavor to the game. And actually, I also kind of do this in reverse. They're getting ready to throw their whatever, and then I'm explaining the difficulty, but in narrative form, and I'm passing them the appropriate dice as I do this. Again, I don't do this all the time, but every once in a while. You charge the Transition with your vibroblade, and as you do, he hisses at you, "You killed my brother," and then I switch out the thing that's upgraded to get it. And that's when you realize that his back is to the sun, and the light just catches the blade of his blade and into your eyes, and you have a harder time. Here, roll the dice. You might want to put more effort into it than I do, but anyway, that's probably a video, right? Okay, that is it for today. And one more thing before we go. This shirt, do you like this shirt? Do you want this shirt? It is in my Teespring store. You can have the shirt. Get the shirt.